call Active Watchful Waiting Incorporated. Catherine Anderson. Karina. Sorry. Community Liaison and Public Officer from Active Watching Waiting. Good afternoon, and thank you for coming along. You may have heard me address the other witnesses in relation to unparliamentary language that you may, I don't know if you are, but if you quote someone who has used unparliamentary language, could you refrain from doing that, please? And also, if you, and I don't know if you are going to identify anyone in a public space who may not wish to be identified, if you could refrain from doing that, the committee would be grateful. Thank you. I invite you to make an opening statement of 5 minutes. When you first speak, if you could announce your name and your title for the benefit of Hansard.
Okay.
Thank you.
Now, I time my speech. If I breathe, it's 5 minutes, 31 seconds, and I need that breath, if that's okay.
Sorry?
I timed my speech, and
yes.
it's actually 5 minutes, 31 seconds, and
we won't pull you up.
Okay.
It just means you've got less time for questions.
All right. My name is Catherine Anderson Karina. I'm the Community Liaison and Public Officer for Active Watchful Waiting. Okay. So our members of Active Watchful Waiting are a mixed group: parents, teachers, health professionals, detransitioners, transsexuals, and members of the LGBT community. And I would say, despite our differences and diversity, what unites us is our deep concern at the pipelining of young people onto the conveyor belt of products and services that underpins the profits of the gender affirmation industry. The major profiteers of this industry being the medical and pharmaceutical organisation. The major brand of this industry is gender identity, to be your authentic self via a product line of drugs and surgeries. Its core target market is the youth, LGBT, autistic, vulnerable youth with mental health comorbidities, and young girls susceptible to social influence and contagion. With regards to this bill on this table, it's playing its part in the gender affirmation process in two ways. One, being part of the social transition process, and two, through legitimising the conversion therapy process of LGBT children. So one, social transition starts with documentation. In schools, it involves the referencing of and recording of students' gender identity, new name and pronouns, clothing and bathroom use, etc. Changing the sex on the birth certificate is taking the child's social transitioning to another level altogether. This is not a neutral act. Most youth, if pushed to socially transition, will move on to the second stage, which is medical transitioning. This involves taking of chemical castration and endometriosis drugs used to interfere or block puberty, cross-sex hormones, and the last stage is extreme body modification, mastectomies, and physical castration. Instead of a future healthy life with a body undamaged, these children who medically transition are set on a course for lifetime pharmacological dependence and increased risk of cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis, thrombosis, sterility, and probable sexual dysfunction. This bill takes an active part in this gender affirmation process because it does not just note the gender identity, what the child feels about themselves at that time. It legally falsifies the child's sex. It is dubious that this bill is affirming an existing transgender identity. It is for most youth creating a transgender identity. Because without this type of interference, children that have an incongruence or disconnect with their body, up to 80 to 98% will grow out of it once through puberty. Furthermore, more than 2/3 of those youth who would normally grow out of this will grow up to be gay or bisexual, as there is a high correlation with gender nonconformance, homosexuality, and bisexuality. What children are told if they are gender nonconforming is they are born in the wrong body because they have a gender identity that does not match the gender norms or behaviour expected of their sex. In line with this idea, a female child more likely to grow up lesbian is expected to present as a trans boy, and a gender non-conforming male child is expected to identify as a trans girl. Once a child is identified as trans, state education policies, Victoria State Schools, for example, make a gender affirmation plan. So these impressionable LGB young people effectively are groomed to conform to a heterosexual norm. This is conversion therapy. LGBT organisations like LGBT Defence, Coalition of Activist Lesbians, LGBT Alliance Australia and LGBT Tasmania call it transing the gay away. The other distinct cohort is girls. Before 2012, gender dysphoria in the past was almost exclusively boys, roughly 0.01%. But girls are now the majority of children who are transitioning, and this is more to do with gender ideation, a fixation on gender identity through social influence and contagion. There are more than 95 gender identities thus far. In research, they're commonly referred to, these kids, as having ROGD, rapid onset gender dysphoria. My co-founder of Active Watchful Waiting also runs Australia Parents of ROGD Kids. She deals with 4 to 5 calls a week from distraught and desperate parents of these girls. She told me recently of a typical call. A sobbing father called through, desperate to stop his 15-year-old daughter from cutting off her breasts. In the state he's in Australia, if he denies her, this is child abuse. And he could lose her to the family court system so she could be taken from her home, as have many others been taken. Under the family court system, there are criminal sanctions if he speaks of this. So he is one of over 1,000 of these parents she has dealt with in the last 7 years, are gagged. They suffer in silence, and the system keeps most Australians in the dark on this reality. This movement is not a grassroots movement. Self-ID laws are one of the several laws the Transgender Lobby's handbook, and I've got notes on this, instructs trans lobbies to put into place to enable children to be transitioned. Sex should in no way be removed, conflated, or be replaced with gender identity in law. We should affirm all people's birth sex as their legal sex while ensuring all people, protection from discrimination or interference based on their gender non-conforming appearance or behaviour. That's all.
Thank you. Laura, do you have a question?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for your oral submission just then and for your written submission. I'm going to put to you the similar question that I've put to other submitters today, and it's in relation to whether or not there are any other amendments that could be made to the bill that you see might be able to fulfil the purpose or the intent of the bill, whether or not that be more in line with the Tasmanian Law Reform Commission or whether that be more in line with Victoria or the way it is right now.
I would actually say that you need to withdraw it and do your homework because you haven't taken in all sides of the events. My background is analysis. You cannot make any decent product or bill or anything unless you've heard all sides of the story, and you haven't. You haven't heard all sides. You haven't heard from women, you haven't heard from parents, RGD. I set up a whole site, lostwomensrights.com, and it goes through 12 major areas this impacts, and we've only heard of a few, 3 or so areas, but there's far more than that. The homework has not been done, and I'm quite happy to share any information on any topic on this area. Now, as to the TLRI, I remember researching that. They again were ill-informed, and there's several ill-informed things behind this bill. One, the Yogyakarta Principles. Now, that has no agreement with any of the nations and any of the governments of the United Nations. It has no formal legal status whatsoever. So I'm not sure why it was referenced at all as something that is kind of like to give it legitimacy or validation. However, we are signatories to the UN Conventions of Children's Rights, and this violates some, I think listed about 9 of them. And we also are signatories of the UN Convention of All Discrimination Against Women, which only refers to biological female. So I'm at a loss as why we reference something that was put together primarily by activists, and yet we aren't honouring our agreements with the United Nations. If you could answer me that, I'd be interested.
Thank you.
Sandy?
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Catherine. You quoted statistics, 80, I think you said 80 to 98% of young people, I'm not sure the terminology you use, but basically their gender identity or any confusion by the time they leave puberty has been resolved. Is that correct?
So there's a bit of a history behind the transitioning of children. Now, originally, they called it gender dysphoria, okay? And how it was handled in the past was a kind of approach of exploratory therapy, or they call it commonly watchful waiting, which is they'll take a child with a psychologist and psychotherapist, etc., in the family, and they'll investigate everything. And usually what they've found in that process is that the reason why they've got an incongruence with their body or disconnect with their body, or they don't feel comfortable in their body, has been a whole bunch of things: internalized homophobia, autism, mental health comorbidities, that kind of thing has primarily been the past. And with watchful waiting and individualized care, they've gone through that process, and puberty tends to handle most of it. A lot of the kids, 2/3 of the kids find out, oh my goodness, I'm gay, and they've got a community to go and support them. Most recently, you've had also, not just that, you've had gender ideation, which there's been a push, and we've seen that through in the schools because they've been pushing gender identity through the schools. We've got indefenseofchildren.org that gives you the material that shows what has, it's been basically from my personal perspective, I call it trans indoctrination. There's basically a handbook to this, and the handbook says, give lots of sympathetic stories about transgenderism to make this, acceptable and get everybody on board and sympathetic to this gender identity. But you've got children, and children are highly impressionable. We in just normal everyday things like television, we don't have certain things showed in children hours because they're impressionable. But when you've got, say, for example, a young lesbian who is, typically gender non-conforming, and you've got some young teacher who identifies that kid as a trans boy, and they surround them, and there's so much celebration about being trans as opposed to being a lowly lesbian, then you've got, they started them on the pathway, and then you start to embed that pathway when you start putting documentation and clothing and changing the names. And I make a comment, in Australia, this is happening behind the backs of parents. We've been collecting testimonies of this as well. This is a really undemocratic, but it seems to be un-Australian as well, that the state is stepping in to the guidance of the child. And that's a violation against the UN Convention of Children's Rights. There's quite a few violations there. But these days, what happens is, just to let you know, particularly with the conversion therapy bills, as these kids are automatically put on a one-size-fits-all solution, which is they're trans. And they're started on their social transitioning, which you're making this a part of, and then the medical transitioning, and then hopefully not surgical transitioning. Now, the target market is the children, of which I've emphasised. They're not so much interested in the adults. Most of these adults are 75% of the trans-identifying males are actually what's called AGP, autogynephiles. They get a sexual turn-on for identifying as a female. So most people aren't talking about that. This is a very different cohort to what it used to be. I've dealt with before with trans identifying men to get them jobs, and also got them to, there's a lady in Chatswood in Sydney who helps them with their makeup and clothes and things like that and present well, blah, 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 and all the rest of it. They're a different cohort to these transsexuals, far different to that. No, it's this one of the perspectives I have is this, it hasn't been talked about, is the industry that this is part of. And it's very much targeted to the youth. Because once you've got a youth on this pathway, they're at least worth 250K. But when you go the old way, which had them come through puberty intact and accepting of themselves, the whole of themselves, not just a sliver of their personality, which is gender is only part of, then you've got no money. There's no money from that. But a subscription model with the conversion therapy process, that money is for their whole life. They're going to be they'll have dependence on pharmaceuticals and medicals, even if they transition. At the moment, one of our projects has been working with detransitioners to get them help, medical help and psychological help. And it's been so hard because so many of these practitioners are chilled by the laws going around, so they can't get the help they need. I mean, one of our practitioners who has spoken up, and we managed to get him the support to sue the psychologist who lied to him. He had to move state to get the help he needed. And this is not just him. This is who we're dealing with. We're dealing with the after effects of detransitioners. So I'll tell you something that I've told the Australian Psychological Society, because they ignored us. We will make sure these people who are part of this process will be sued. We will fight to the teeth for a Royal Commission on this. We will fight for the teeth for a Parliament inquiry on what's been happening with these children. And this hiding of what's going on, it's wrong.
Jason,
thank you, Catherine.
Jason, I understand you got a question. We're over time, so.
No, that's fine, Pete. I've
Any
certainly
questions
heard
you
enough.
have, we can answer it, and quite a few more.
Yeah.